All right, guys, welcome back to our discussion on World War One. So, what we're going to look at first, real quick, is here's a quick little list of the main ideas and of things that happened during World War One, and then we'll get into more of the nitty gritty. All right, so by the end of the war, a good 8.5 million soldiers were dead, even more millions were wounded. Hundreds of billions of dollars was the cost economically, plus just all the destruction of pretty much everything everywhere that where the fighting took place. Right. So you could also label this the period the people of this period like the lost generation because so many young men died in the course of this war. It would take a number of years for populations in Europe to recover from the loss of life due to World War One, also known as the Great War, the war to end all wars. All right, so one big thing that we need to talk about is the fact of geography. Germany is right smack in the middle of where the Allies are. You have Britain and France on the west, and you have Russia on the east. They are stuck between the two like areas of Allied forces, so they have to fight a two-front war. They're fighting on two sides. And before World War One had started, Germany had already been getting a plan in place on the off chance that war did break out and they had to fight enemies on both sides of the country. And this was developed by a general by the name of Schlieffen. So it's called the Schlieffen Plan. It is a strategy to fight a two-front war. All right, so the basics of it are they cut through Belgium into France. They could destroy France quickly with the vast majority of their forces, and then they turn their attention to Russia. And this is because Russia, while it is a very large country with the biggest European population at the time, it takes them forever to get their army ready. They're a little less, their armament is a little less. They're more spread out. Their stuff doesn't work as well. They're just technologically not quite up to par with everybody else. So take out France, who was one of the top dogs in Europe at this time. Then you go after the big, slow monster that is Russia. All right. So here is basically the plan. We have Germany in the purple on the right. You cut through Belgium using it as a shortcut because along that France-German border is actually more heavily defended areas. So the German plan is to bypass, go around those French defenses and basically hit them from behind and taking them off guard and beating them a lot faster, including taking Paris, the capital of France. All right. So how do you make this work? Speed. But it did not work because the French and the British had much stronger militaries than Germany anticipated, and Russia moved a lot faster than anticipated. If this war had been fought about 30 years earlier, Germany would have been able to carry this plan out successfully, really, because they, 30 years earlier, they were the top military. Now Britain and France are on equal level with German military capabilities, and Russia, while they are still behind, they're doing a lot better than they were. So one battle that really needs to be talked about is the First Battle of the Marne, which is a river that is in France and Belgium. Really, it's in France. All right. So the Germans, they get within 15 miles of Paris. That is huge because no one expected them to get that far. At least the Allies didn't. So the British and French, they launch a counterattack, and to get soldiers to the front lines, they're even using the taxis of Paris to move soldiers to the front. And this is the battle that stopped the Schlieffen Plan from being able to be finished. It halted it dead in its tracks. And so, yeah, there you go. There's the map, the Marne River right there, coming from Paris and moving east, like that top, the middle river line right through here. So that just bounces the Germans back. All right. Now, this is going to then create what we call the Western Front. So this is where a stalemate occurs. No one's moving. They start digging in and digging these trench battle lines that eventually, as you can see, are going to cover 500 miles from the North Sea. So basically the area of water east of Great Britain, and all the way down to the Swiss Alps in the south. That is a huge battle line. You never saw battle lines like this before in warfare. This is the length of entire countries, not just, a few square miles like it would have been in the past. Now, trench warfare was pretty much as brutal as it got, right? So there's bug and rat infestations that are, they're chewing on the men in the middle of the night while they're sleeping. Their food is not in the best condition either. Fresh food was not a thing. And sleep, you're not getting very much sleep because there's constant shooting and explosions going off. And between the two different trench lines, the Allies and the Central Powers, is no man's land. And it's called that because it was expected no one could survive out there if they got caught out there by themselves. All right. It's just a crater-filled stretch of mud and blood and nastiness that you just don't want to get caught in. All right. Now, some trenches would be very elaborately built. Those were typically the German trenches. They built them to last. They had much better quality trenches. They had, in some cases, drainage systems put in place so that the soldiers weren't walking in mud all day, every day. They had bunkers that men could go down into and sleep in, and it was just a better situation than the Allies had. They kind of just threw theirs together, right? So, yeah. And with all these trenches all over the place, like you see, then there's these trenches that move from one line to another, so that there's a way to fall back in case the enemy reaches the first one here, like after they cross no man's land. You can then retreat down this corridor to a new defensible line and then hopefully push back and retake your first trench and then maybe chase them back across no man's land to their own trenches. And not to mention, you're crossing over barbed wire, and there's going to be landmines and all sorts of stuff like that in the way as well. All right, so here is an aerial shot of the trenches. Now, the trenches on the right are the German ones, and the ones on the left are the British. I think you can tell just from that who put a lot more work and time into designing their trench work. And yes, that would be the Germans. Germany is known for their organization and engineering skills. They put all of that to use during World War I with building these elaborate defensive systems. All right. Now, occasionally, they would try to tunnel from one trench to another. Typically, that did not work because they would end up collapsing on themselves, or the traps of trying to blow up the other trench wouldn't work very well. Explosives wouldn't go off. Sometimes the tunnels, like a German tunnel, would mine into a British tunnel. Then there's fighting going on under the ground as well as above ground. It was just a huge mess. So there wasn't a lot of tunneling going on like this, but it did happen from time to time. Right? Of course, there's going to be a lot of World War I pictures going on here. We got, guys just hanging out in the trenches trying to get some sleep while another guy's keeping guard. Right? There's another one, guys just hanging out, just trying to not get killed. And this one, if you can tell, the guys in the background, they have gas masks on. This is the result of a gas chemical explosion attack going on. This guy in the front who's like grasping at his throat, he is dying from poisonous gases. All right, weapons World War One. The machine gun became a iconic and well-used piece of killing hardware. One team of like 3 guys with a machine gun could lay waste and keep 100 men pinned down easily. So the machine gun got extensive use as a defensive weapon during these attacks of mass waves of men moving forward. Men were dropping by the hundreds in these attacks within, minutes, 3-4 minutes. You might have, 600 dead bodies just laying in the mud. Poison gases, the Germans got into it first. The results would typically blindness. Sometimes it would be permanent. Other times it would just be temporary. You never knew. It just depended how the chemicals reacted to your body. Men would choke to death on these fumes. It would cause chemical burns on their bodies, which would be excruciatingly painful. And a lot of these things would potentially cause death as well. You never fully knew what the effect was going to be of the gases. All right. Some of them were chlorine gases, and there was mustard gas. Stuff like that was just brutal, brutal, brutal stuff. And one interesting piece to note there, Adolf Hitler, the leader of Nazi Germany in World War II, he was a soldier for Germany during World War I. He actually, I believe it was not once but twice, suffered from and survived gas attacks, which the chemicals, he was even temporarily blinded in his final attack that he survived. And the World War I actually ended while he was recovering in the hospital. All right, moving on. Here's an example of the machine guns. That is a Vickers machine gun on the left. And there is an early attempt at a gas mask for a British soldier. You can tell by the style rifle that he's using. That is a Enfield battle rifle, which was a British rifle. All right, the tank was first introduced in World War I. They were basically tractors with metal, like steel plates around them with guns put inside these metal boxes. That's a very blunt and quick way to describe them. Airplanes had been in use, but World War I is where they first started to use planes for fighting purposes. It would originally start out as planes being used just for doing photography of enemy battle lines and troop movements, things like that, until eventually the pilots of these planes from opposing sides would start shooting at each other with pistols and shotguns, even just bolt-action rifles. You would also have them dropping stuff like grenades and sticks of dynamite down into the trenches, and this would eventually evolve into having mounted machine guns on the planes and bombs that they could then drop onto the men below. So that is the origin of the fighter plane and bomber planes. All right, we also get what are called Zeppelins. These are basically, think of a blimp, but used for, warfare. They have guns and bombs and stuff like that on them. And in some cases, they would have planes attached to them that they would then deploy into battle from these. That wasn't very often, but it did happen on rare occasion. All right, here's an early example of a British, I believe it's a Mark IV tank. All right, there's a style plane. That type, I believe, is a fighter plane. And that is what a Zeppelin looks like. All right. Also, we're going to get submarines being used for warfare on a massive scale. The first successful one was actually during the American Civil War. The Confederates had a submarine. But in World War I, we get mass use, and The Germans had what they called the Unterseeboot, or the U-boat for short, and they would see even more extensive use in World War II. All right, here's an example of what a U-boat looked like. Now, you would think that with this technology, the war would move fast, but the thing is, they had improved weaponry, but they did not improve the tactics used to fight the war. So nothing is going to change unless you change the way you fight, okay? Which is why World War II was a little better when it came to how the war was fought. Because if you have these trench battle lines and you're still fighting as if men are lining up in rank like in the Civil War or the Revolutionary War and just shooting at like lines of men shooting at lines of men, you don't do that if you have these fast firing machine guns and these massive artillery cannons and these repeating rifles where you can fire off 5 shots in 30 seconds. You just don't do that with this type of weaponry. It just creates massive amounts of casualties, which is why, you might have 1 million casualties in one battle over the course of like 3 weeks. That is a massive amount of loss. Now, in 1917, the US is going to join the war on the side of the Allies. And this is due to the Germans not caring about who they are hurting with their U-boats, their submarine warfare. Because 2 years earlier, they torpedoed the Lusitania, which was basically a civilian ship, but it was also transporting military goods to the British. It was sunk with a torpedo, and it actually killed well over 100 Americans. The American public is up in arms over this. Just like, how could they do this? And, it's like they put a restriction on using their submarines. But then, as time went by, they started doing a little worse and the worse. Like, you know what? We need to get using our boats again, and I don't care what the repercussions are. We're also going to have cultural ties that'll pull us in because, this is basically like democracies versus monarchies. We also have more common history and language with like the British. We all speak English. Our country used to be a colony of the British. So there's a lot of shared history there. And, we were allies with Russia, and that's just going to create a whole other set of problems. A democratic government did step in after Tsar Nicholas II stepped down in Russia, but that didn't last very long at all because there was a communist or Bolshevik revolution that took Russia out of the war, and now Germany could use all their forces against the allies in the West, meaning France and Great Britain and now the US. And the final thing that fully pulled us in is the Zimmermann telegram. Basically, the Germans were like, hey, Mexico, start a war with America so they stay out of Europe, and we will assist you in retaking the states of Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, parts of California, so that you get back territory that they stole from you. And Mexico and also Britain intercepted the message too, and they turned it all over to the US, and it's just like, this is what they're trying to pull. Is like, and America's just like, oh, I don't think so. So now we're going to go put our boots on the necks of Germany for this. Now we declare war on Germany, April 1917. They launch a huge offensive after Russia comes out. And before we get there, but then we get, over 1 million troops there. We launch a counterattack, and we just start pushing them back and back and back until we finally win. The Kaiser Wilhelm II, he steps down. Germany now enters an armistice, and we basically are going to start getting the peace talks. An armistice is basically a ceasefire. We're going to stop fighting for now, and we're going to see what we can do to end it all and hopefully have peace. All right, that's where we're going to end. And when we come back next time, we'll be talking about the peace treaty, the Treaty of Versailles.